encourage your soul, enlighten your mind, and empower your faith. This is the Light Network.
Welcome to Inside the Scholar's Study, where we discuss all things concerning Scripture, faith, and scholarship. My name is Brad McNutt, and if you're ready, we're actually kind of on location today. It's not inside the Scholar's Study. We're in a classroom with other people watching, other than usually just the three other people that normally watch. So here we are, and we're looking at Jerome's prefaces so far this season. I don't know. We've talked about this, but I don't remember it. Are we going to do this like mini series, I guess you'd say, on different things, or is Jerome this whole season?
No, I'm still imagining that we'll do the mini series on different things.
Okay.
We'll see what happens. I mean,
for those who don't know, behind the scenes, you never know. Like during the off season, we're like, yeah, let's do this. And then I come here and he's like, yeah, I decided not to do that. I'm like, well, great. I just read 3 books on it, but it's okay.
Oh, do you prepare for this?
Sadly, yes. Actually, no, I don't. I just show up and do what I always do. You know, if we had Carol here, you know, it would be a complete class, you know, us fighting and talking about all kinds of random things. So, anywho. All right, so we're Jerome's prefaces. We left off, we were talking a little bit about his preface to the Pentateuch.
Yeah, I think we talked about the New Testament quotations of the Old Testament. Just to remind listeners then, Jerome, in his preface to the Pentateuch, which is not the first preface that he wrote, even though if you were looking at a Latin Bible, it would be the first one you come to because it's the Pentateuch. But this is about the year 400. He's translating the Pentateuch out of Hebrew into Latin, a controversial thing. He always, in all of his prefaces, then, because he is causing controversy, and remember, the controversy is created because the Latin world is used to a Latin translation of the Septuagint. That's what Jerome grew up with. That's what everybody in the Latin-speaking Christian world grew up with, is a Latin translation of the Septuagint. And Jerome is bypassing the Septuagint, going straight to the Hebrew. And so in all of his prefaces, he is justifying that decision to not translate the Septuagint, but to translate the Hebrew instead. And so part of that justification is Jerome says that the New Testament quotes the Old Testament according to the Hebrew and not according to the Septuagint, Jerome says. And this is turning a traditional Christian argument on its head because typically Christians would say the reason we use the Septuagint is that the apostles used the Septuagint. And Jerome says, no, they didn't. They used the Hebrew text. And he's got, I think my recollection is, did we talk about this last week, Brad? Am I repeating?
I think we mentioned this just a little bit.
Okay, and so he lists off 5 in the preface to the Pentateuch. He lists off 5 times that the New Testament is quoting the Old Testament, and they are. I'll just read you the verse references. Although, of course, Jerome didn't have verse references because there weren't numbered verses in his day, but in this, according to our verse references, he lists off Matthew 2:15, Matthew 2:23, John 19:37, John 7:38, and 1 Corinthians 2:9 as the passages, or at least as some of the passages in the New Testament that prove that the New Testament writers use the Hebrew text and not the Septuagint. And I feel like we talked about this, that those verses don't exactly prove that. I mean, one of them I think is pretty good evidence. The Matthew 2:15 one, out of Egypt I've called my son. I think that does give good evidence that the New Testament Matthew was using something closer to the Hebrew text than to the Septuagint, because that verse reference does not match the Septuagint for Hosea 11:1. The others are not as good evidence, but they are, I mean, maybe they're all problematic quotations, but they don't necessarily provide good evidence that the apostles were using the Hebrew as opposed to the Septuagint. But anyway, these are the verses Jerome cites. And so, and then, you know, after citing those verses, he quotes the verses, and then he lists the biblical book in the Old Testament that he thinks those verses are tied to. And then he says, I'm just going to pick up reading in his preface now. After doing all that with the New Testament verses, he says, many people are unaware of these things, and so they pursue the delusions of the Apocrypha and prefer Spanish dirges to the authentic books. And here's what he means. Some people are so unfamiliar with the part of the Old Testament that is being quoted by the New Testament that they assume that the New Testament is quoting Apocrypha instead of the Old Testament because they can't find the quotations, right? So like, out of Egypt I've called my son. I can't remember if we talked about this last week, but out of Egypt I've called my son, which doesn't match the Septuagint. And since they are only using the Septuagint, that is their Old Testament translated into Latin, they just assume, well, Matthew must have been quoting the Apocrypha then. You know, we can't find the quotation, so it must be an apocryphal source. And Jerome is pointing out, no, it's Hosea 11:1, but it's according to the Hebrew text. It's not according to the Septuagint. And so he says, many people are unaware of these things, and they pursue the delusions of the Apocrypha. They assume the New Testament is quoting the Apocrypha and prefer Spanish dirges to the authentic books. What's this business about the Spanish dirges? He's referring to Priscillian. There's a man named Priscillian. In fact, by the time Jerome writes this, that man, Priscillian of Avila, who he's a Spanish monk. By the time Jerome writes this in 400, that person has already been executed for heresy. This is one of the first times that there was an execution for heresy. I believe that was the year 385 that he was executed for heresy. Now, his heresy, I don't know what all the heresy of Priscillianism involves. It's not about advocating Apocrypha, I don't think. I think it's about other things, but this advocating of Apocrypha was a part of it. At any rate, that's what Jerome is referring to. Priscillian was, that's an example of someone who thought, and we do have the writings of Priscillian, so we can say this for certain, that with regard to, for instance, out of Egypt I've called my son, he said, well, that must have been an apocryphal source. So Jerome is criticizing that. And then he says, it is not my task to expose the reasons for the error. I think what he means is that why the Septuagint and the Hebrew text are different. He says, the Jews say that it was done by a prudent decision, lest Ptolemy, a worshiper of one God, detect a double divinity, even among the Hebrews, whom he was regarding very highly, therefore, because they seemed to fall into the doctrine of Plato. All right, so we'll have to think about what Jerome is getting at here.
I was just going to say that first.
He says it was
that first fight did not age well, for either side. It just didn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. But to be fair, I've been in a few of those. They don't age well. So.
Yes, that's right. The Jews say that it was done by a prudent decision for Ptolemy. All right. So Ptolemy, let's remember the translation of the Septuagint is there's a story about the translation of the Septuagint that it was done for a particular person, and that person is Ptolemy, the king of Egypt. This is the early 3rd century BC. This is Ptolemy II Philadelphus, according to the traditional story. The traditional story is found in the letter of Aristeas and other sources. And what Jerome is apparently saying is that Jews, according to a Jewish story, Jerome says, the Jews changed the Septuagint for Ptolemy's sake. That is, they did not translate the translators of the Hebrew Bible into Greek did not translate literally for Ptolemy's sake, because Ptolemy might run into trouble. And I'll talk about this trouble in just a second, what kind of trouble. But Ptolemy, the king of Egypt, might run into trouble if he was able to read what the literal Hebrew text says. And so the translators adjusted the wording of the Greek text to make it a little easier on Ptolemy. Well, okay, so there are various things to talk about that, but let's talk about this trouble. He says, lest Ptolemy, a worshiper of one God. Okay, that's a point here. Jerome says that Ptolemy, the king of Egypt, was a monotheist. Okay, and then we'll all want to know, was he a monotheist, or is Jerome just making this up? And I honestly, I do not know whether he was a monotheist or not. I mean, maybe. I haven't. That is a failure of my research. I have not done any research on the theology of Ptolemy. Possibly he was a monotheist, but I mean, that's not the way I would normally think of the Greek kings of Egypt, but maybe. I mean, who knows? Okay, so lest Ptolemy, Jerome says that he was a worshiper of one God, lest Ptolemy detect a double divinity even among the Hebrews, whom he was regarding very highly, therefore, because they seem to fall into the doctrine of Plato. Okay, so what Jerome is saying is that Ptolemy, who is a monotheist, liked the Jews because he thought they were monotheists. Well, Jerome doesn't say that Ptolemy thought the Jews were monotheists. He says that Ptolemy understood that the Jews were following the doctrine of Plato. And what Jerome must be thinking here is that Plato himself, the Greek philosopher from the 4th century BC, Plato was a monotheist. Was Plato a monotheist? Well, sort of, yeah. I mean, I'm not an expert in ancient Greek philosophy, but I mean, maybe Plato was the kind of guy that we would call a monotheist. Meaning, like, Plato did, I believe it is correct to say that Plato did believe in a supreme being above every other divinity. I don't know if we would call that monotheism. I mean, maybe Plato would call himself a polytheist, but meaning he believed in all kinds of supernatural beings, but there was one supreme being that was the pre-existent one who created, maybe didn't create all things, but at least created the things that created the other things. You know, there's one supreme being that everything can be ultimately attributed to.
Is this
Is that
like
monotheism? I guess it
henotheism?
depends on what we henotheism. How do we define henotheism? Moberly has recently brought this up in some of the readings. Is that right?
I don't know if I've
That you
come to
have
that
read?
part yet. I'm
Oh,
reading them
okay,
right
yeah.
now.
But yeah.
Well, I mean, just a
Okay.
quick, simple search is adherence to one particular god out of several, especially by a family, tribe, or other group, is a dictionary.
Yeah, I mean, I would not. tend to so that henotheism and monolatry is like the same thing. Is that right?
I think that they're very
I
similar if they're not
I
the
have
same.
trouble distinguishing. Yeah, I would think of this as a little bit more beyond that. So it's not just that there's a whole bunch of gods and you're going to worship one of them as your exclusive relationship with that god. But this seems to be a loftier claim that there is a God that is above all the other gods. All the other gods are subordinate to this one God
So this is kind of like
because 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 this one God created all the other gods.
so is this kind of like divine council type stuff that some people argue? Close, has some similarities at least on the
Yeah, I
surface.
think close. Yeah, right. The Greeks definitely had this idea of a divine council, but usually that's Zeus is the leader of the council. I think again, I mean, I've said like this is not my expertise, but I believe this is right. That Plato would actually not say that Zeus is that creator god, but there's a god above that created these other lower divinities. I think this is right. Okay, so like, where am I getting this? If you want the Platonic dialogue that deals with this, it's the Timaeus, and then there's of course scholarship on this as well. At least I can say this: that there was an early Christian tradition that Plato was a monotheist, and of course that Plato got his monotheism out of the Bible. Which that's ridiculous, but there was an early Christian tradition that Plato had read Moses. I don't think that's right, but okay. So Eusebius, for instance, I can give you the reference if you're interested. The Preparation for the Gospel is the work. Book 13, chapter 11 is on Plato's monotheism. So I think at least Jerome is saying that Plato was a monotheist. I think he has good reason to say something like this. And he means that Ptolemy was also a monotheist. He thought the Jews were monotheists. And so Ptolemy respected the Jews because of this monotheism. But this led the Jews, in order to not lose the respect of Ptolemy, they wanted to translate the Hebrew Bible not literally, so that Ptolemy would not suspect that they were not monotheists. So the idea that Jerome is proposing is that the Hebrew Bible actually attests not strictly to simple monotheism. I think what Jerome is getting at is the Trinity. I think that's what he is, that of course, if I think what Jerome is saying is that the Old Testament attests the Trinity. And if somebody who is not trained in understanding the Bible comes across references to the Trinity, they're likely to interpret them as references to polytheism. And so the Jews wanted to guard against that. So they didn't translate the Hebrew Bible literally with its references to, let's say, multiple divine persons, so that Ptolemy wouldn't think they were polytheists and either make Ptolemy mad at them or mislead Ptolemy into polytheism or something like this.
So he doesn't give any references or like any passages.
He does not. Oh man, I wish he did. I mean, because of course this is people love studying this these days. I mean, scholars have been studying these odd references to multiple divine persons in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible. I mean, exactly the kind of thing I think Jerome is getting at. He is just not very specific. I wish he gave the verse references. and I'm going to talk about problems with, if I'm understanding Jerome correctly, problems with the way he's thinking through this, or at least the way he's representing it. I mean, remember, this is all, from Jerome's perspective, this is all argument against his opponents. So he might, I mean, it's apologetics. He might be sort of massaging the data to agree with him without getting into specifics. But so I think he's saying that the Hebrew Bible does contain references to multiple divine persons. This is hinting at a Trinitarian view of God, and this helps explain why the Septuagint is different from the Hebrew. Okay. Okay, let's talk about the references in the Hebrew Bible to multiple divine beings, and then we'll talk about the Septuagint and its representation here. Multiple divine beings in the Septuagint. Well, I mean, you have stuff like, "Let us make man in our image," and in Genesis 1:26, you've got those divine plurals. Genesis 1:26. What else is it? Man has become like one of us. Genesis 3:22. The reference in Genesis 9 to let us go down and check on the Tower of Babel. Or Isaiah 6, who will go for us? And, here am I, send me. So you have those references. You've got other references. I probably need to get out a Bible to get exact verse references, but I'm thinking of the Sodom and Gomorrah story, Genesis 19, where there's a verse that's always cited, even, and I mean by ancient Christian writers. They cited the divine, those plurals to talk about the Trinity. Ancient Christian writers did, but also, oh yeah, it's verse 24, Genesis 19, verse 24. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah sulfur and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And so the way this is interpreted in early Christian writers is, you've got two references to the Lord here, and one of them, basically, to cut to the chase, one of them is Jesus, and one of them is God the Father. So this is Genesis 19:24 is another hint at the Trinity. You've got others. I can't.
So in this, I'm interested because I actually preached this text Sunday, and so I've been preaching the Abraham narratives.
What, Genesis 19?
Genesis 19, and I did not pay attention to this, and so I'm assuming they're thinking the Lord who rained down sulfur and fire from the Lord, that the first Lord would be a reference to Jesus, a pre-incarnate, maybe Jesus, and maybe that's the one. That's the third, quote, angel from chapter 18. Because you've got the three men that enter in Genesis 18.
I don't know if they made that connection, but yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. And then you get I take it as one of those angels being the Lord himself. And Abraham stands still before the Lord, that he's actually having a face-to-face type interaction. And that's why you then see it translated down to 2 when they come to Sodom.
Yes, you're right. I misinterpreted your reference to the third angel. You meant the angel that stayed behind is the third one. Yeah. Okay. Right. Yes, they definitely made that connection. Absolutely. Okay. That is Jesus, the pre-incarnate Christ. I mean, I don't know that they would say it's Jesus. It's the Son of God. Anyway, I am not interpreting the text of Genesis 18. I am reporting what I understand to be early Christian interpretation of Genesis 18, that, or any part of the Old Testament. Early Christians, certainly this goes back before Jerome. I mean, this goes back to Justin Martyr, like the earliest Christians post New Testament. Anytime the Lord appeared on earth, that's the pre-incarnate Christ. That is the Son of God, because God the Father doesn't. The incarnation reported in the Gospels teaches us that the person of the Godhead that appears on earth is the second person. And therefore, we can take that knowledge that we derive from the incarnation and read back into the Old Testament that anytime the Lord appears on earth, that is the second person, that is the Son of God. And so, yes, Genesis 18, this is the Son of God talking to Abraham. The other two are angels that go on down to Sodom, but the one that stays behind, that is the Son of God. Yeah, and I guess this is also in Genesis 19, verse 24. Yes, the first one would be the Son of God. The first reference to the Lord would be the Son of God, and the second reference would, because it actually says he's in heaven, that would be God the Father. God the Father stays in heaven. It's the Son of God who makes the appearance on earth. There are other references like this. I mean, to multiplicity, duality, maybe in the concept of God. I mean, the angel of the Lord, Justin Martyr was mentioning that as a reference to the pre-incarnate Christ. And there are other references like that. The pillar of cloud, the angel in Exodus 23, verses 20 to 23, I think it is. The angel that will lead the children of Israel into the promised land. My name is in him, so you better obey him because he won't forgive your sins. This reference to an angel that's got the ability to forgive sins, again, interpreted as the pre-incarnate Christ, the Son of God. So we do have these. I mean, and again, this is not just early Christians noticing this. I mean, it is early Christians, but we have ancient Jews. Philo of Alexandria even talks in some of his writings about, Philo, who was not a Christian, a second God. The Bible talks about a second God. He actually uses the term theos. Of course, Philo is writing in Greek, so theos, a deuteros theos, a second God, is reported in. I mean, he saw it. He saw these things. That's very similar to the way. I mean, Christians wouldn't use that term, a second God. They took very much care to not use that kind of terminology. It's one God, but it's three persons. But it's the same sort of idea that they're getting at. So we see this in rabbinic literature. They're noticing these things. They have their ways of talking through. And modern scholars also talk through it. If listeners want like a good modern scholarly account of these sort of things and how the ancients thought through it, Larry Hurtado has a big fat book called, what is it called? Lord Jesus Christ, from 2003. I think it's 750 pages, but of course, he's a Christian. Well, he is a Christian, but Larry Hurtado, but he is writing just as basically a secular historian. He's trying to use that hat as he writes this, but he is certainly interested in how Christians thought through these things. That's what the book is about, but it gets into these issues as well. Richard Bauckham is another one. He's a Christian and he's more explicit about his Christianity, but he's also sort of interpreting the New Testament through these, in other words, the question for Christian scholars often is, how do you get to this point where you've got basically Jews, the earliest Christians were Jews, where you've got Jews who affirm one God and they worship Jesus, who they know was a human being, an actual human being that existed among them, who was crucified, no less. And they are affirming that they worship one God and they worship Jesus. How do they put that together? What are the concepts that they're bringing with them to that kind of way of thinking, or those devotional practices, to use the term that Larry Hurtado uses? And it's this kind of stuff out of the Old Testament, those Jewish concepts, Philo and the rabbinic, all those things, all those interpretations is what they're bringing with them. And I assume that this is part of what Jerome is thinking about.
The Richard Bauckham book, I'm assuming we're talking about Jesus and the God of Israel.
Yeah.
That one.
Yes, right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's the one from 2008, I think, right? It's a collection of articles 250 pages or something. Yeah. I mean, anything Richard Bauckham writes is going to be top notch. And yes, so yes, everyone should read that book. And same for Larry Hurtado. I mean, he passed away a few years ago from cancer, but fantastic scholar.
And really, when you talk about that, that's I'm kind of preaching to some of the narratives in John, and a great deal of those debates center around that. They think Jesus is being blasphemous because he's making himself equal with God. I mean, so it's the debate in the New Testament in Jesus's ministry, and you can see where they're coming from. Like if they have this really strict idea of monotheism, and they have a lot of reasons for being there.
Yeah.
So maybe some appreciation for the context and why it was so difficult for them to accept.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. I mean, paying attention to these sorts of things does definitely help understand parts of the New Testament. I mean, major themes out of the New Testament. So Jerome is saying in his preface to the Pentateuch that if the Septuagint translators had translated the Hebrew text literally, it would have given Ptolemy the impression that there were multiple divinities, or he says two, a dual divinity. And that's why they changed did not translate literally. And that is, he's trying to explain why are there differences between the Hebrew text and the Septuagint, or, to even push it a little further, Jerome speaking, why is my Latin translation straight from the Hebrew Bible more Christian than the Septuagint? And it's because the Septuagint was translated for a pagan. To be amenable to paganism, and my translation, I'm obviously a Christian translating for Christians. So my translation is more Christian than the Septuagint is, which again is like completely turning around the usual Christian way of thinking about the Septuagint as the Christian text provided by God. Now, I do think there are problems with Jerome's argument here. I mean, there's all kinds of ways we could take this, but is the Vulgate more Christian than like the older Latin translation that came from the Septuagint? I mean, maybe in some ways. I think there has not been a whole lot of work done on that, or at least I haven't seen the analysis. There are some ways, though, in which Jerome's translation is more explicitly Christian. His translation of the Hebrew Bible is a more Christian some way, and the one that comes to my mind right now is that he actually mentioned the term. He actually mentions the name Jesus a time or two in his translation of the Hebrew Bible. I can't remember the verse references, but it's in the minor prophets is one I can remember. So there might be something to that. Jerome says this a number of times, that my translation is more Christian than the Septuagint is. So presumably he had some ways in which he thought that was true. But another issue here is that like the things I've just been talking about are in the Septuagint, like the divine plurals that we mentioned, let us make man and let us go down. The Septuagint has those plural. Bottom fire from the Lord. Well, that's translated just perfectly literally in the Septuagint. The other things, I think, the angel in Exodus 23, that's in the Septuagint. So it's hard to, like, if I have hit on the right theme, if I'm understanding Jerome correctly and I've hit on the right theme, this business of the plurality and the Godhead, well, that's, the Septuagint isn't disguising that, in fact. Okay, number one. And then number two, the Septuagint is different from the Hebrew Bible a lot, but it doesn't have anything to do with that theme. It's just other stuff, like different interpretations of certain things, different Maybe the Septuagint was translated from a different Hebrew text than the one Jerome had in front of him. There are reasons to think about why the Septuagint is different from the Hebrew Bible, but it's not about the representation of God. And in fact, the representation of God, it seems to me, is pretty consistent from the Hebrew Bible to the Septuagint. So I think Jerome has probably hit on an idea that he thinks will appeal to his Christian audience, but he's massaging the facts here. He's not exactly being forthcoming or straightforward about how he's arguing about it. But he says, another thing he says is, the Jews say that it was done by a prudent decision, lest Ptolemy, have this idea. Now, is there any evidence for that? In fact, there is. Do we have a Jewish tradition? We do. It's in the Talmud. And I now have the Talmud pulled up on my computer. This is the version of the Talmud that is on the website called Sepharia. And I am looking at Tractate Megillah 9a. And go down to on Sepharia, it divides it into sections, and I'm at section 11, and it says, the Gemara continues. I'm just reading straight out of the Talmud. And this was due to the incident of King Ptolemy, as it is taught in a Baraita. There was an incident involving King Ptolemy of Egypt, who assembled 72 elders from the sages of Israel and put them into 72 separate rooms, and did not reveal to them for what purpose he assembled them, so that they would not coordinate their responses. He entered and approached each and every one and said to each of them, write for me a translation of the Torah of Moses, your teacher. The Holy One, blessed be he, placed wisdom in the heart of each and every one, and they all agreed to one common understanding. So the point is that here's the little story in the Talmud that says that Ptolemy didn't just bring together 72 translators. That's the traditional story. He brought together 72 translators and they translated the Pentateuch. But no, the Talmud says that he actually put each one of them into different rooms and told each one of them to translate individually the entire Torah. And so what you end up with after that process is 72 different translations of the Torah, 72 Greek Pentateuchs, one from each of the translators. Why would Ptolemy do such a thing? Because he wanted to check their fidelity. He didn't trust the Jews, and he wanted to make sure that they really translated accurately. And he knew if there were differences among the 72, he knew that they were trying to trick him. But if they were all the same, he knew that they must be translating accurately. And it ended up that they were all the same, but it wasn't because they were being accurate. It's because God inspired them to be different. This is a really weird Jewish tradition, but I mean, here it is. It is actually related to some things we read about in Christianity, also Christian traditions about the Septuagint. So it's because it says at the end of that, what I've already read, the Holy One, blessed be he, placed wisdom in the heart of each and every one, and they all agreed to one common understanding. And they wrote for him, and this is what it says, they wrote for him, God created in the beginning. Now that's a quotation from Genesis 1:1, but it's not quite the same as Genesis 1:1. The Hebrew says, according to the rabbis, what the Septuagint translators put, of course, they're reporting it in Hebrew, and the Septuagint translators would have had it in Greek. They're reporting it in Hebrew because the Talmud's in Hebrew. Elohim bara Bereshit. Well, that's not actually a quotation from Genesis 1:1. The Hebrew Bible says Bereshit bara Elohim. Bereshit, in the beginning. Bara, created. Elohim, God. Bereshit bara Elohim. In the beginning, created God. That's what the That's what the Hebrew Bible actually says. But the rabbis say that what the Septuagint translators put was Elohim bara bereshit. They rearranged the words so that God comes first. God created in the beginning, as if they had translated straight off word for word, it would have misled Ptolemy into thinking like, I don't know what, Bereshit created, like Bereshit was the name of some prior divinity that created God or something like this. There would have been misunderstanding. They also say, and they wrote, so let me just summarize this tradition. According to this tradition, among the Jews in the Talmud, God inspired the Septuagint translators to make changes to the text of the Bible, and those changes are sometimes in relation to how the Bible represents divinity. Okay, the second change, I shall make man in my image and likeness. According to the Talmud, that's what it says. I shall make man in my image and likeness. But, so in other words, that is that divine plural problem where the Hebrew text, let us make man. According to the Talmud, the Septuagint translators put it in the singular, I will do it, not we, but I. Okay, so that is something like what Jerome was getting at. But I'll just say the Talmud is not accurately reporting what the Septuagint says. I've already said it, and I'll say it again. I just checked it just to make sure I wasn't misremembering. The Septuagint does say, let us make man in our image, Genesis 1:26. It's got the plural there in the Septuagint.
Yep.
So
It's first person
I'm
plural
just saying,
subjunctive.
yeah, there it is. So the Talmud itself, I mean, people have studied this. The Talmud has a list of changes. The Talmud has a list of changes that the Septuagint translators supposedly made to the text of the Bible. But for the most part, those changes do not actually correspond to the Septuagint. And so people have studied, like, what in the world is going on here? Where did these changes come from? Where did the Talmud sages get this idea? What are they trying to say? And not all the changes are related to like the representation of the divine in the Bible. Some of them are just other stuff that are just weird. Like why would the Talmud sages even think that there needed to be a change there? Like what is the point of any of this? So those things have been studied. For our purposes, I can just say, like, it doesn't actually correspond to the text of the Septuagint, but it does correspond to exactly what Jerome is reporting here. So presumably Jerome has been in contact with Jews. Of course, Jerome couldn't have read the Talmud because there was no Talmud in Jerome's day, but these traditions were being circulated. The Talmud is preserving earlier traditions. Presumably what has happened is Jerome has talked to some Jews about the Septuagint, and they have told him that, oh yeah, we've got a tradition that when Ptolemy got the translators together, the translators actually changed the text of the Septuagint by inspiration of God. And now Jerome leaves out the inspiration part, but he does say that they changed the text for this reason, for Ptolemy. And it helps Jerome make the case that the Septuagint, the implication is, like I've already said, that the Septuagint is the pagan text, and it's my translation that's the Christian text. And so people should like my Latin translation more than the Latin translation of the Septuagint. All right.
So translation wars have always been around.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Actually, the stakes are probably lower now than they were in previous centuries.
Yeah, well, certainly, yeah. I mean, like in 2025, I mean, the stakes are pretty low. Like, the issue, certainly in the English-speaking world, the issuing of a new English translation, I mean, Even people who care about the Bible barely notice when a new English translation comes out, because it seems like 4 come out every year. But I mean, 75 years ago, the stakes were a little higher. I mean, there were book burnings and all that. But okay, let me just finish this paragraph then from Jerome's preface to the Pentateuch. Therefore, wherever any scripture attests something sacred about the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, either they, the Septuagint, translated in a different way, or they were altogether silent, so they might both satisfy the king and not divulge the mystery of the faith. So I don't know if, does Jerome think this was a bad move on their part, or, it was a tough situation and they did what they had to do, or I don't know if he's criticizing them, but he's definitely saying, even if that was a good move on the part of the Septuagint, we're not in the same situation, and we can fully reveal the mysteries of God now. So we shouldn't be relying on the preliminary translation that the Septuagint gave us. We should be relying on a Christian translation. Okay, Jerome says, and I do not know who was the first author that by his own mendacity constructed the 70 cells at Alexandria, in which they were divided and wrote up the same things. Jerome says, I don't know where this idea came from, that the translators were separated into different cells and each told to translate individually the Old Testament. So where did that come from? So we just saw that the Talmud has that idea. There are also Christian sources, not our earliest Christian sources, but Irenaeus, that's 2nd century, he says it. Late 2nd century, Irenaeus says that Ptolemy actually separated the translators to test them, to see if they would really give him the correct translation. Now, according to Irenaeus, it worked. And God inspired according to Irenaeus, the translators of the Septuagint were inspired by God, but not to change the text of the Septuagint. They were inspired by God to represent perfectly the Hebrew Bible. So the Talmud says they were inspired to change the text. Irenaeus says they were inspired to give a perfect translation of the text. So there's similarities, there are differences. But anyway, Jerome says, where'd this idea come from? That they were separated into different apartments to translate it. He says Aristeas and much later Josephus recall no such thing. Those are our earlier sources about the translation, the letter of Aristeas and then Josephus in his Antiquities of the Jews, book 12. And they don't say the translators were separated. They say they were all together and they worked together. They rather write that they were gathered in a single house and discussed, not prophesied. And then Jerome says, for it is one thing to be a prophet, another to be a translator. And I'll stop the reading there for this episode, but I'll just say that was, again, a common Christian idea about the Septuagint translators, is that they were basically not translators. They were indeed prophets because they were inspired by God and that idea is actually not originally a Christian idea, but it goes back to Philo. Philo is the first one to say that the translators were in fact prophets who enjoyed communion with the Spirit of God and produced a perfect translation.
Interesting.
All right.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right. So we've got a little bit more on, well, I mean, not on this episode.
Yeah,
we've got some more.
There's some more in the preface to the Pentateuch, and maybe once we get done with that, we'll do a different mini series.
All right. Well, anything else you want to add to this one before we're closing it down?
No, that'll do for now.
All right. We want to thank you for being with us today, for always listening and supporting. Of course, the videos are available on YouTube. Everywhere you get your podcasts, you can follow this podcast or like or subscribe. I forget what it's called nowadays. But anyway, when I originally started, most people, like, they didn't even know what a podcast was. So you had to explain that. So I don't know if it's like, follow, subscribe, something. You know what button to hit, and you can get it on demand, okay? You can email us at scholars@thelightnetwork.tv. And again, we are grateful that you were with us today, and hope that you'll continue to be with us and come back with us next week as we go back inside the Scholars Study.